Hello everyone, we are from Group 9. In this video, we are going to discuss about slavery in the chocolate industry case study. My name is Ninda Alia and I will be accompanied by my teammates Nur Atika and Muhammad Shamil. Before we get started on the questions, let's have a brief overview of the case. 45% of the chocolate we consume around the world is made from cocoa beans grown and harvested in the Ivory Coast, which is a small nation on the western coast of Africa. Now, a portion of the Ivory Coast cocoa beans that goes into the chocolate we eat was grown and harvested by slave children. The slaves are boys between 12 and 16, but sometimes as young as 9. They were kidnapped from their village and sold to the cocoa farmers by traffickers. The plight of the enslaved children was first widely publicized in the early 2000s when True Vision, a British television company, took videos of the slave boys in the Ivory Coast farms and made a documentary. In 2001, the US State Department estimated that about 15,000 children from neighboring nations of Ivory Coast had been sold into slavery to labor in Ivory Coast farms. The fact that farmers in the Ivory Coast used slave boys to farm their cocoa beans was already known to American chocolate makers. Pressured by anti-slavery groups, the Chocolate Manufacturers Association stated on June 22, 2001 that it condemned these practices and agreed to fund a study of the situation. On October 1 of the same year, the members of the Chocolate Manufacturers Association and the World Cocoa Foundation all signed an agreement to establish a system of certification that would verify and certify that the cocoa beans they used were not produced by child slaves. The 2005 deadline that the companies had set came and passed without the promised establishment of a certification system. By early 2008, the companies had still not started to work on establishing a certification system or any other method of ensuring that slave labor was not used to produce the cocoa beans they use. And by 2011, the problems of certification still remain unsolved. So, what are the systematic, corporate, and individual ethical issues raised by this case study? The systematic issues related to the legal aspect is that the law is poorly enforced. Although slavery is illegal in Ivory Coast, factors such as open borders, a shortage of enforcement officers, and the willingness of local officials to accept bribes from people trafficking in slaves all contributed to the problems. In relation to the economic aspect, the prices for cocoa beans in global markets have been depressed for most years since 1996, which made the cocoa farmers turn to slavery to cut labor costs. The corporate issue is that the farmers rely in middlemen to get cocoa to the market. This is because the cocoa farmers work on isolated farms, thus they cannot communicate among themselves nor with the outside world. So, the middleman would buy the farmer's cocoa for half of its current market price and sell it to the market. The farmers does not have the capital to buy their own trucks, so they must rely on middlemen. Furthermore, although the Chocolate Manufacturers Association and the World Cocoa Foundation agreed to establish a certification system, they still cannot control everything because there are around 1 million cocoa farmers located in remote local regions. The individual issues are first, child trafficking and slavery are definitely illegal. Second, the farmers who made the slave boys work from sunrise to sunset as well as beating and starving them was immorally wrong. And lastly, the consumers who know about this should not just ignore this problem.
With the topic of child slavery and slavery in general, the question asked is whether there are any sort of moral reasoning that can possibly justify its occurrence in an industry. First of all, our group fully agrees that any form of slavery is morally and lawfully wrong because not only does it degrade a person, morally degrade them, it also removes their God-given rights to be able to free to choose on what happens to their self. It also can force them to be inflicted on pain and cause lifelong injuries and complications. For the concept of child slavery and child labor in general, actually, It's been a common occurrence in developing nations or nations that lack insufficient education or insufficient laws that mandate it. And for that reason, we can liken them to how they are lawfully and morally wrong, as their children are intrinsically not mature enough to be able to make this life-changing decision or have a life-changing decision forced upon them. So for that, we can liken them to as having not having an age of consent. Child labor inherits the same connotations as forcing someone with mental illness, someone that cannot be held accountable for their decisions to make life-changing decisions for themselves. Besides that, the children who are usually forced in these labors are, or maybe economically forced, whom are not even sufficiently paid for the work, mind you, they should not be responsible for the finances of their families. That responsibility should be held by the parents. And should the parents not even have sufficient funds to support a family in the first place, then they should not have decided to have children. This is where the topic of education comes through, because a nation or government that provides sufficient education to would-be parents or parents on the implications of having children would make them better prepared on their decision, and maybe make them rethink if they have insufficient resources, insufficient funds, and or if they currently do not have any resources to support their families.
And now, moving on to the next question: who shares the moral responsibility for the slavery occurring in the chocolate industry? Is it the farmers, or the African government, or is it the American chocolate companies such as Hershey's and Nestle? Or is it us, the consumers itself, as we are the ones who created the demand for the chocolates? The moral responsibility for slavery in the chocolate industry is shared by all the actors in this industry. It can be either directly or indirectly. Child traffickers are obviously morally responsible for the situation, as they are the ones who lure the children to work at the cocoa plantation in order for them to gain money when they are in fact being enslaved. The farmers and plantation owners also should not be using these children for labor under any circumstances and putting them in dangerous working conditions and letting them using dangerous tools. As for the African government, they also shares moral responsibility regarding this issue. When the US Department of Labor's in 2014 report found that their National Police's Anti-Human Trafficking Unit only had a budget of about $7,000. So even though they legally have prohibited slavery and child labor, their actions still does not reflect that. And the American chocolate companies and distributors are also held morally responsible, as they knew that those farmers uses slavery labor, but they continue obtaining their source of cocoa from them. And lastly, for all we know, even we as the consumers are held morally responsible if we know that about this situation and the company that produce our favorite chocolate are actually obtaining their source of cocoa from a cocoa plantation which uses slavery.
The phrase "to be ethical, it is enough for business people to follow the law" is taken from Velasquez's book, and it refers to that when business activity is conducted following the laws of their respective governments, then that business activity is inherently ethical. Throughout the case, slavery in the chocolate industry, none of these multinational chocolate manufacturing companies have actually technically broken the law. They purchased these cocoa beans from legitimate suppliers, and it is actually none of their concerns on where these suppliers might have acquired them from. It is none of their concerns if these cocoa beans were actually procured from child slavery or just slavery in general. But that doesn't actually make them, any of them, inherently ethical, because in the case, it is also stated that the members of the Chocolate Manufacturers Association have known for quite some time, even before it was widely published, that the cocoa beans they procured that their suppliers procured were from the results of the child slavery camps in the Ivory Coast. So it is actually just boils down to profit because even the system that they agreed to implement because of the widespread media attention to abolish these child slavery, they have not made insignificant progress until this day, and they even actively tried to lobby the passing of a bill that regarding the slave-free labeling system. So just their actions can actually be boiled down to profit because the companies that acquires these tainted cocoa beans will not sacrifice their well-being for the well-being of others. And these, in this case, the children in these child slavery camps, whom the higher ups, the management in these companies don't even know, don't even want to concern themselves with. So yeah, that's the end of the presentation. Thank you.